Welcome to Reaction with me, Ian Martin. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and you can become a subscriber to our site by going to the site Reaction and become a subscriber. You get my regular newsletter on politics and all the great work daily produced by the team on politics, economics and culture. Today, I'm joined by John Mills and by Caroline Flint. We're going to be talking about their Institute for Prosperity, founded recently to boost the arguments in favor of more manufacturing in this country on the basis that growth post COVID-19 is going to be the way out of Britain's problems. John and Caroline, welcome. Caroline, what was the thinking behind the new group?
Is what it says on the tin, Prosperity, Institute for Prosperity. And by doing so, we can raise the standard of living with better paid jobs and also help fund our public services better for the future. And I suppose I have to admit I have a real personal connection to this because having represented a place like Doncaster for the last 20 odd years, in Doncaster and other parts of our country, in those sort of post-industrial towns and communities, manufacturing offers another way in which those communities can find a new sense of purpose as part of the national economic endeavour, and that has my full support.
John, what was your thinking when you first set out to found this?
Well, we're concerned that for a long period of time, the British economy has been growing more and more slowly. And I think that the situation is that if we don't change from where we are now, we're probably going to finish up with an underlying growth rate of maybe 1% or something per annum, which simply isn't enough to start raising living standards. At the same time as we've got some really very expensive problems coming down the track on climate change, on healthcare, on social care, on education and training and pensions, all of which are going to bite into people's living standards. So we really need to get the growth rate of the economy up by at least a couple of percent to deal with all these problems without having living standards falling. And if you say, well, what do we need to do about this? I think the most important single thing to do is to get the amount of the GDP that we spend on investment up from where it is at the moment. It's really very low at 17%. The world average is 25%. In China, it's way over 40%. And this is the main reason why the economy is growing so slowly. What we really need to do is to shift the incentives that everybody's having towards spending more money on investment. And the only way really we're going to do that is to make it economic and profitable to cite industry in this country rather than abroad. This links back to Caroline's point that really a lot of the problems we've got have arisen because we've deindustrialized to the extent we have. And this has left us with too little part of the economy which has got big productivity increases. They're much easier to get in manufacturing than they are in services. And because the percentage of GDP coming from manufacturing has gone down from about 30% as late as 1970 to less than 10% now, this is one of the major causes of the slowdown in growth, which we need to reverse.
Caroline, why do you think that this has happened? We all lived through the new Labour years, through the Thatcher experience before that, and Britain's become very good at services, also very good at certain parts of manufacturing. Britain still does have some very good manufacturing, but why has the economy adjusted in that way? And it was sort of seen for a long time as a positive thing, or maybe just the way that the world worked. Why did it happen?
I think there was a sort of sense of inevitability, and part of it was, I think, is that when some of those big industries declined, coal mining, for example. When I first became an MP in 1997, I still had a deep coal mine in my constituency. It's not there anymore, but there were still pits around, but much depleted from where they were in the past. And it was really clear that even the Labour government, with its massive majority, couldn't reinvent that industry. And I think we've seen that in other areas as well, in steel and chemicals. My husband's family's from the northeast Teesside. His father was an industrial chemist on Teesside. So we saw those declines, and part of the problem, I would say, is between sort of the 18-year period and before that as well, but particularly from 1979 to 1997, there hadn't been the sort of investment back into those communities to reinvent themselves. So what I inherited was a community in which those actually quite well-paid, stable jobs had been completely hollowed out, and nothing had been put in to replace them. And also the infrastructure around the community wasn't enough to be attractive to investment. Now, you've been to Doncaster, Ian. You came out on a visit with me. We saw Hitachi, who are helping to build the Zuma carriages for rail, and that's fantastic. But it's taken over 20 years to get to that point, and we need more of that. And I think, if anything, what's really come into sharp focus during this pandemic is when, as a country, in the early days of the pandemic, where we couldn't find a company to basically make the personal protection equipment, where we were finding shortfalls within our own economy and having to reach out. And let's be honest, some mistakes were made along the way in terms of the outsourcing and contracting for some of the demands we had to provide provisions and products. I think it's taught us a lesson about how unprepared we are in the country, how lacking the resilience that we need, but also we're going to have to think of a new way to do our economy. And, you know, it's not the only tool in the box, but manufacturing, I think, is important to that. And just to say something on that, on a positive level, only just last week, I found out that, again, a firm in Doncaster, in Thorn, is going to be they're going to be helping with the contract that Pfizer's won to create the vaccine. And that's brilliant, but we need more of that, and we need more of it across the whole of the UK, particularly in communities that have felt left behind.
John, do you think it was just a sort of natural development, just part of the, you know, Thatcherite would say this was just a part of globalization, a reorganization of the economy, a restructuring, and certain parts of the economy, the southeast and services and the city boomed from the mid 80s onwards, and that's really just the way the world works. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that what has actually happened is something slightly different. Let me take you back a little bit to the 1970s and 1980s, when there was a real problem with stagflation and inflation, and the whole of the Western world shifted towards having a monetarist and neoliberal approach to trying to deal with these problems. And I can understand why everybody wanted to get inflation down, but what I don't understand is why nobody paid any attention to what it was done to get inflation down, which was restricting the money supply, having sky-high interest rates, did on the competitiveness of the economy. And I was running a business at that time, which would just run out of business altogether, because we got to a stage where the raw materials we were had to buy, we just couldn't cover the cost of these because the exchange rate was so high. And I think we've suffered from this really ever since. We've had an overvalued exchange rate for the last 40 years. And this is what's really caused the deindustrialization, which is the root problem which we're facing. Because the trouble is, it's just not economical, it's not profitable to cite the sort of manufacturing and investment that really increases living standards in the UK, rather than citing it in somewhere in China. And I don't think this is just a UK problem. I think it's a problem for the whole of the West, that we've allowed our cost base to get too high in relation to what it is in the East. And as a result, manufacturing has slurped away from the West to the East to a massive, massive extent, leaving the Chinese with a huge growth rate running up to nearly 10% per annum, while ours just dropped back and back and back. So I think that the answer to your question is that big mistakes were made in taking our eye off the ball of competitiveness in the 1970s and 1980s, which has been allowed to continue ever since. And that's the underlying cause of the low growth rate we've got now.
Caroline, Flint, it does feel as though something is shifting, isn't there, across the political spectrum. Boris Johnson, post-Brexit, pre and post-Brexit, is very interested in this concept of levelling up, and very interested in these ideas on manufacturing. Keir Starmer, running Labour, obviously is from a different perspective as well. What do you think the government should be looking at doing in practical terms?
Well, I think what it should be very focused on is some of the announcements it's it's already made, how that spend is going to actually happen in reality. I mean, just last week we obviously found out that they're going to, we'll probably hear it from the Chancellor later on, that they're going to increase defence spending by, I think it's £21.5 billion over the next 4 years. Yeah. Again, that's going to be in shipbuilding, but it's going to be in high-tech equipment as well as cybersecurity. And there must be a space within that for British firms to win contracts to deliver those goods, and then all the supply chains into it. And of course, a lot of that sort of work doesn't have to rely on being on London and the South East to deliver the products that are needed. On climate change, John is absolutely right that there can be a cost to climate change that may prove problematic for people, particularly those on low incomes. But there's also an opportunity here, whether it's through energy or different ways in which we manufacture cars or make goods greener and cleaner. There must be an opportunity within that for Britain to show that it is at the forefront of investing in those areas of our economy and the jobs that come with them. I mean, look, you could do some parts of the climate change and get a job with a PhD, but if you've got a ladder and the equipment, you can put solar panels on the roof of a house. It has that broad, every person appeal if they get it right. So investment, definitely government investment has to go up, and they have to be smart about it, but also skills and training in these areas too. I mean, I think we're really poor as a country in retraining people when they're in work to be able to do the newer work that's coming down the line. But I think training, power, technology, investment, and importantly, let's make sure that some of the infrastructure spend, whilst it might go on the HS2 projects, also has to look at those more localized regional infrastructure projects that make sense for business and communities to locate in areas and get people from one place to another as well for work. That's crucial. If you don't do that, places like Doncaster, Stockton, and many other towns won't be able to be part of that wider economic agenda.
John Mills, you are a Brexiteer and prominent in the campaign to leave the EU. How does Brexit figure in this? Because anyone watching this who's either a Remainer or a former Remainer or concerned about the what's going on in terms of the Brexit talks will say, look, we still don't, this is great on manufacturing, but we still don't know the basic terms on which Britain will be trading next year. Surely that is a huge problem for business.
Well, I mean, I think my views on Brexit have been pretty similar to yours over the years.
Yeah.
And I think we are in difficulties at the moment because these negotiations have dragged on and dragged on and dragged on. I have to say, I do think the EU has been very difficult about seeing our point of view on level playing field and fishing and Northern Ireland and the role of the ECJ, all these other issues that are really very prominent at the moment in obstructing a deal getting into place. But I do think the fact that this is going to the wire right probably to December now is very unsettling for business. I mean, people need to know with some certainty what they're going to have to be dealing with in January, and we just haven't got that certainty. I have to say, having said that, I think the British industry and the infrastructure we've got generally, the people who've got handling it, I mean, I don't think we're going to find that the roof falls in. I think people will find a way through these problems, but I don't think that having all these difficulties right at the last minute on top of coronavirus have been a help.
So, Caroline, as John was saying there, you've got these structural problems in the UK economy. Then on top of that comes COVID, and now soon Brexit, proper Brexit rather than transition. Are you, to what extent are you worried by the impact of Brexit?
I think I'm on one level less worried about that. I mean, I think we want certainty, and that's absolutely the case. I mean, you know, as a Remainer, I voted for deals in the last Parliament because I just thought, look, we need to get on with things here. But what is really worrying is what has happened to our economy as a result of the pandemic. I mean, I was just looking over some of the figures yesterday, and whilst there was a bounce back from what I understand in the summer when the restrictions were lifted, which was, you know, positive, the amount of borrowing the government's had to make, the number of people who are now unemployed has doubled, I think, from January of this year. And that is something that's going to have to work through for, I think, longer than people might expect. But the other side of that, maybe, Ian, it will allow an opportunity for some new thinking about what we're talking about today and how our economy is run, and what it means to have, we talk about climate change and sustainability and what have you. Well, we need both resilience and sustainability going forward. And I think that's why being part of the Institute for Prosperity is a cross-party approach to see if we can maybe try and add voice to amplify to other experts in this area, because there are many voices on this particular subject, but to try to get across that some of the decisions we need to make about our economy have to be looking 10, 20, 30 years down the road, just in the way we have to look at climate change, just at the way we have to look at pensions or social care. And if we could have some sort of cross-party consensus, it'll still allow the Conservative Party and the Labour Party to finesse it to their own ends. But we need the building blocks there to restart our economy and do it different from what we've done for maybe the last 30, 40 years.
What's your instinct, both of you, on taxation, which obviously impinges a lot on business and in terms of what business can do on business investment, and business investment or national investment will be lower as a result of the pandemic, and they're looking at a budget deficit of at least 350, possibly even higher. How do you get the balance right, John? First on taxation, do you think taxes are going to have to go up? By how much? Where should the burden fall so that it doesn't jeopardize what you're seeking, which is a manufacturing recovery?
Well, I think there are basically two approaches to dealing with the huge amount of debt that's been accumulated. One is to do what I suspect the government will do, which is to carry on as they are, try to get the total debt down by raising taxes, which I don't think is going to help the economy at all. I think you then finish up by having a lower and lower growth rate. And you then finish up with a real problem about controlling the amount of debt we've got in relation to the size of the national income. Now, the other approach is to say that what we've got to do is to get this ratio better, not by paying off debt, but by getting the economy bigger, so the ratio between the total amount of debt and the size of the economy falls the right way. And that seems to me to be far, far more preferable an approach to adopt. But then you're back to what are you going to do to get the growth rate up to make this happen? And that's really where you run into all sorts of, I think, quite tricky problems. I think personally what we need is a combination of changes on the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, I think you've got to do something about the competitiveness of the economy, which is a difficult issue around the macroeconomic policy and the exchange rate. Then you've got to complement this with a whole mass of supply side changes to increase the amount of money available to manufacturing industry and education and training, less short-termism, more spending on infrastructure, all this kind of thing to get the economy to grow more quickly. But I think we could get the economy then to grow maybe a couple of percent more rapidly than it has done, getting it up to 3.5% per annum. And then I think you'd find that the debt would fall away quite quickly. And that's the approach which I think the government ought to adopt.
So, Caroline, John says growth effectively is the only way for us to get out of this mess in the public finances.
Look, I'm always up for a discussion about how we can spend our money in the public services in a smart way. I think that's always room for that discussion. But the truth is that let's just take something like social care. We can't go on as we have been in terms of how social care is provided and how it's costed and who pays for it. There'll have to be some serious cross-party consensus to get that sorted out for a start. Climate change, in the short terms, there are going to be costs for climate change to meet the zero carbon. And we already know that the government's bringing forward, whether it's getting rid of petrol, diesel cars, gas boilers and everything else, there's going to be cost implications for that too. But I do think the only way out of this is in terms of growth, because what other way is there? If we don't grow our economy, we won't have the money coming in to actually provide for good, smart public services that we all need. So I very much hope, and I have no reason to think that this will not be the case, compared to 2010, when we had the changeover of governments and following the 2008 financial crash, when everything was about cutting back to the bone, so to speak. I don't think that is going to happen in the same way now. I think there's a recognition that actually if you cut too far too fast, you just basically suffocate the economy because nobody's out there spending, everything slows down. But clearly the way out of this is through growth. So investment, yes, and the government's committed to that, but let's for God's sake make sure it's done in a smart way, in a way which we can see real results and a journey to that growth strategy that we absolutely need. And that will mean making some tough choices about what to invest in and what not to invest in. And that's not a bad thing, to start focusing in on what really works and what really pays.
And what would you characterize that as being? What stands the best chance of working?
Well, I do think that it's around high tech to allow businesses to manufacturing to use the best technology they can. It's about energy as well, because energy costs are massive, and I think that's an important aspect that we need to deal with on our journey to zero carbon. Skills and training as well, but also about making sure our infrastructure spend actually goes to some of those communities around the country who, look, I think in somewhere like Doncaster, compared to 20 odd years ago, we've actually done well in the sense of I can see the infrastructure around us that is already making a difference. We need to sort of, if you like, turbocharge that to actually make sure we get the fruits of all that investment that's gone before, but more of it. And for businesses, I would say, just on tax, I mean, I think it's when I was on the Public Accounts Committee, we talked a lot. We talked about actually doing some more work at looking at what are the tax incentives for businesses. What I tend to hear is that there's too many different sorts of tax incentives out there for businesses or credits. Many businesses don't take advantage of them because they're either too small or actually the bureaucracy is not worth getting involved in it. I think if we could make better sense again of focusing in on what we need as a country in terms of skills and trainings, getting our businesses, SME businesses, to get the technology that they need to power forward, more confidence about exporting. If we could drive some of the tax incentives and credits towards that direction and make it much easier for the SME community to be part of that, I think that would be a good way forward. And not forgetting, Ian, that we did this on the Public Accounts Committee as well. When we saw that through some of the big platforms like Amazon and others, that some of the goods that were coming into our country were not necessarily paying the VAT that they should be paying, therefore putting our own manufacturers at a disadvantage, we do need to make sure that in those areas that there's fair play when it comes to selling goods.
John Mills, what sort of feedback have you had from government and the opposition? Well, I mean, it may well be that people are just too consumed at the moment with the immediacy of the COVID crisis, but do you detect interest in the ideas that you're talking about?
Yes, I think there is some. I mean, I think it's been very encouraging for a start that we've managed to put together an advisory committee with Caroline as the chair, which is really genuinely cross-party, with people like Vince Cable involved, and Conservative MPs, Lord Vincent, other MPs and peers, right across the political spectrum. So we're really not a voice crying in the wilderness. I mean, I think there is also a very substantial feeling that we've got huge problems as a result of the coronavirus, let alone Brexit and all these other issues, climate change and these other problems we've got coming down the track. And that really what we do need to do is to have a radical look at how we do run the economy, why it's been slowing up over a long period of time, how we're going to recover from coronavirus. I think we're in a different situation now than we might have been 2 or 3 years ago when there was much more complacency. Now I think there is more concern about what the long-term future is and more willingness to look at radical solutions to try and find a different way of running the economy more successfully.
John Mills, Caroline Flint, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
A real pleasure. Thank you.